Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back from lunch and welcome to the session on Mission Life and Agenda for Sustainable Development. PM Modi introduced the concept of life or lifestyle for environment at COP26, and the date was 1st November 2021. In fact, this was a call for the global community as a whole to change the lifestyle, and it was more like an international mass movement to protect the environment, to preserve the environment, and align lifestyles with the environment. Though this is contingent upon the individual, it calls for collective action. There's no doubt about that. Neither there is any doubt with the fact that human life and livelihoods are inextricably linked and are integral components of the broader natural ecosystem. And rather, this interface needs to be redelineated at the social ecological system. And it is our unbridled human ambitions to develop which has brought the planet in peril and at its tipping point. And in the process, it has affected human well-being, human life, and human livelihoods. That is precisely why we shouldn't construe climate change as merely an environmental problem. It is actually a developmental problem. It emanates from the forces of development, gets through the environmental channel, and in the process, in the long and the medium term, affects the various developmental parameters. Now, lately there have been talks about the consonance and the intersections between LiFE and SDGs. And there is no doubt that the principles of LiFE are embedded in the SDGs. And lately, in fact, it has also been contended that as far as SDG 13 is concerned, which talks about climate action, which essentially entails both adaptation and mitigation strategies, is something that you find in LiFE. Some people essentially interpreted LiFE as some kind of mitigation strategy. It's mostly because as you align your lifestyle with the environment, with the ecosystem as such, with the natural processes as such, then naturally you are going to indulge in more sustainable consumption, sustainable production processes, emit less material consumption. So that results in some form of mitigation. On the other side, this is also adaptation because you have to adapt to a new form of lifestyle. So given this, I would rather request the panelists to ponder upon one more question that has been pricking me for some time now. Now, there is this radical degrowth movement that argues for a reduction in global consumption and production, and what we call the social metabolism. And this advocates for socially just and ecologically sustainable society. So ultimately, this results in social and environmental well-being rather than talking of well-being in terms of the GDP growth or some other developmental parameters. Now, the degrowth school opposes sustainable development, just as they oppose green growth. So according to them, just as green growth is an oxymoron, sustainable development is also an oxymoron. And this entire school essentially takes its inspiration from the writings of John Ruskin, William Morris, Leo Tolstoy, as also, in fact, from Indian thinkers like Mahatma Gandhi and J.C. Kumarappa. So the question is, can LiFE and SDG work hand in hand? So what about this notion of degrowth? Is this aligned with LiFE and SDGs? This is now an epistemological concern rather than being merely a policy concern. So the bigger concern right now is, where does the Global South stand here? How do we balance the needs of the developing world and the Global South, given that we have to consume, we have to grow, and where the growth driver, the prime growth driver of the Global South has been consumption? What is required to ensure that the principles of LiFE can endure and have long-term impact globally? So to respond to these questions, I have a fabulous panel, which consists of Mr. Ashish Kumar, who is a senior fellow at the Niti Aayog, Government of India, K. Sita Prabhu, visiting professor and senior advisor at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Florencia Sacchetti, who is a senior coordinator, Social Protection Program at CPEC, Argentina, and Professor Li Jiaun, chair professor, China Agricultural University, in China. So I'll just go by the order as is given, in fact, in the program. So I'd request all the panelists to confine their first round of interventions to within 4 minutes so that we can have another second round. So let me just go to Mr. Ashish Kumar. Sir, the floor is all yours for the next 4 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts on this important issue. The basic theme for the G20 has been, G20 Indian presidency has been one earth, one family, and one future. And LiFE has been the lifestyle of environment, which we are talking about. Now, the question is, to what extent this is embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, which have been adopted by the countries, member countries of the UN. If you look at the Agenda 2030, where we discussed about the transformation of our world, it talks about 5 Ps: the people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. And planet being an important component of the whole dialogue and agreement, I think the two are quite close and quite supportive to each other. There has been a lot of emphasis on individual lifestyle change through reduce, reuse, and recycle systems to achieve a sustainable consumption and production. But let us look at the parameters, important parameters, which really measure it. I won't leave it without measuring it. The material footprint per capita over the period of, say, 2000 to 2017 have been increasing from 8.8 metric tons to 12.2 metric tons, and therefore there has been a 50% increase. Are we listening to the UN SDG agenda, or we are still continuing as it is? Maybe a similar trend continues even after 2015 when the agenda was adopted. High-income countries have a much higher footprint, which is about 25.6 to 26.3 metric tons per person, and low-income countries is just about 1.4 to 2 metric tons. The basic contrast which it indicates is there is a need for an action and has to be an equitable sort of consumption. Another issue which is related to it is the production. And production efficiencies, has it improved over a period of time? And then there's a question of how much domestic material consumption has been per SDG. And if you look at, if over the period of 2010 to 2017, it has been 1.16 kg per dollar. Now, what does it mean? It means there has been no change, no gain. In fact, there has been gain in Sub-Saharan Africa, Oceania, and they are being offset by the other parts of the world. Now, the related question comes, it is not only the lifestyle per se is important for climate issues which we are addressing, but it is also important the whole of industrialization, which is resulting into a lot of effect in climate problems and relating to the environmental degradation. SDG has 4 indicators relating to industrialization. They are manufacturing GDP share, they are manufacturing employment share, they are proportion of MSMEs in the total, and research and development expenditure. But does it address to the climate issue? I don't find. And that is a question which we must address. China has a 27.4% coming from the manufacturing. Korea, 25.64%, and also Malaysia, about 22%. USA has passed that much earlier, so they are at the 10% or 8% in UK. But what is happening to Africa? The countries which have resources, which have a space for industrialization, and they also have skilled manpower, but are we really bothering to industrialize them? Are we really looking for industrializing them? And what kind of industrialization we are looking for in those countries in Africa. My argument is we must look at eco-sensitive industrialization. It is not the kind of industrialization which we have been doing all along and which has resulted into various ill effects. In fact, industrialization has a problem in terms of affecting or stressing the bionetwork, complete bionetwork, and also the natural systems. It affects water, it affects air, it affects soil, it affects biodiversity, and ultimately it affects health and gender. Now the question is how well we can do it. I think in the second intervention, I'll go a little more about this eco-industrialization or and a need for a development of an integrated framework for industrial ecology. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think you have already raised the second question for me for the second round. I mean, how do we really create an integrated paradigm for industrial ecology? So with that, in fact, I'd just, without much ado, let me move to Florencia. Florencia, over to you, the next 4 minutes.
So when I first learned about the LiFE approach proposed by India, the first word that came to my mind is care. Because as we were discussing this morning, and many of our colleagues raised the point of the fact that we are facing multiple crises today that threaten our environment, our economy, our social fabric. And this shows how our development models have failed to address the structural inequalities that we face in society today. So care, it's something that has been in feminist discussions for decades, but it's not just about care, because caring is for people, for communities, for our planet is crucial to sustain life as we know it. And even if in the SDGs, it's only in SDG 5, Target 4, it's something that is cross-cutting to all of them in order for us to really achieve sustainable development. Because it's the invisible foundation of our socioeconomic system and something that we really need and enables us to thrive as individuals and societies. So we have production systems that have historically been developed at the expense of two key resources. There are natural resources and the time that families, and especially women within them, have devoted to unpaid labor. These two kinds of resources have created value that allows our societies, our economies, our markets even to function. But however, their indiscriminate use has also led to this interlocking crisis that need to be addressed simultaneously if we want to achieve long-term progress in this endeavor. And building a more caring society is just about that, because a caring society is one that promotes well-being, prosperity, and resilience. But for this, we also need to rethink our political and economic systems to put care at the core and identify as well the shared responsibility between governments, families, the private sector, and the civil society. This means also not taking the conditions for life as granted, it's something that life just happens, but also asking ourselves, what can we do to really create the conditions for quality and dignified livelihoods? And this means ensuring that our individuals, as societies, and life itself can flourish. To ensure that this LiFE approach is equitable, sustainable, and transformative, I think we need to see these environmental and care crises as two sides of the same coin and try to acknowledge the possibilities and the limitations that both humans and the planet can have. And this also implies avoiding siloed interventions to think from a more ecosystemic point of view and see how we can integrate these fields that normally work in isolation in a way. I think that for this, it's also critical to rethink the measures of progress and development, as the colleagues were pointing out earlier today. Because today we don't have measures, we have, but not GDP, for example, doesn't account for the contribution of nature, of unpaid labor, or measures that properly identify how to measure well-being. We also don't know what are the production costs for family care, for example. At CPEC, we have been working recently to create an indicator, like a basic care basket that tries to identify the threshold of resources that families need in order to produce quality care and ensure the development of the new generations and think how we can start to obtain this information that can then inform policymaking in order to create a more caring society. And also, I wanted to mention that for the last months, we've also been engaging with many organizations and stakeholders who are doing really amazing work related to care within the G20 in order to foster this collaboration and put forth concrete proposals, because also highlighting how addressing the twin crises within the G20, it's critical in terms of human rights, in terms of economic returns. So we see how the G20 stands to benefit from this approach. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Indeed, some of the extremely vital points came out, especially taking an ecosystemic approach and measurement of well-being, an alternate measurement of well-being. So let me now move to Professor Seta Prabhu for her initial interventions.
I thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity. I think it's a very important panel that we are looking at. And my points, basically, I would say that if we are looking at some transformation in the way in which we function, then following business as usual practices will not take us there. There has to be a paradigm shift. I think we are talking of policies from since yesterday and since this morning more particularly, but there has to be a paradigm shift from resource extractive and consumption-centric growth to a process of resource regenerating, conservation-oriented lifestyle. And we also have to recognize that what we are faced with is an existential crisis. It is not a crisis of the earlier types that we had faced. This polycrisis is very different in terms of nature, magnitude, and depth. And therefore, the response to this has to match equally the magnitude and the depth has to match. Because of that, the scale of the threat, we have to really match. I also want to say that if we want equitable and sustainable development, it seems sort of elementary to say that equity and sustainability have to be the two core principles that all development policies have to follow. Why is there any question about anything else? That should be the absolute non-negotiable principles that we have to do if you want a transformational change. One of the key factors that we have been talking about is energy transition, because that holds the key to the transition to a greener and more sustainable world. And here, since morning, we have been talking about how the developed countries have had an advantage, though the historical emissions have been very, very high from the developed countries. The developing countries are struggling to meet their net zero targets, more so since COVID-19 because of the resource constraints and the financial stringency that they are facing, and the need for them to have concessional finance and other mechanisms to take care of the transition. Not only a just transition, but also a just recovery. I think we should go beyond looking at just a transition to a just recovery, and what are the policies that will actually take them there. The International Renewable Energy Agency, in its 2023 report, highlights the fact that the world is off track to meeting the 1.5 degree Celsius target. And many of the G20 countries here, which are responsible for almost 75 to 80% of the GHG emissions, there's a great variation within the G20 in the responses that they have made. I think it's the responsibility and it's the duty of the G20, and maybe it is an opportunity that the G20 has to convince its own members to walk the talk. Commitments have been made. The NDC commitments that have been made will not take us to the 1.5 degree Celsius target. It will be much, much higher, because while commitments have been made, actions have not been followed up and policies are not in place. A second thing that I would say is that the developing and emerging economies have invested about $52 billion in sustainable recovery measures in 2022, which is 1/4 of the short-term investment that is required for net zero targets for 2050. So once again, it's the developing countries which need a helping hand. Many of them are middle-income countries as well and facing problems because of the middle-income status. The third and final point, and the most important point that I would like to make, is that if we want an enduring and sustainable change in the consumption patterns, there is no way without involving the community. So I would say community, culture, and conservation, the 3 C's are the most important part. We have not been talking of communities so far, but without the communities getting involved, it will not be possible. Many of the indigenous communities and the traditional values of ancient cultures in the global south have been preserving nature for its intrinsic value and not for its instrumental value. I think we need to recognize that, nurture that, foster that, and bring forth those values once again into the development. So in short, value-based development is the answer to sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Prabhu. Very sharp and precise and hitting the nail at the right spot. In fact, what I really liked was bringing about the concerns of equity and sustainability together. And probably that is the biggest challenge of the SDG, reconciling between the irreconcilable trinity of equity, efficiency, and sustainability. So thanks for that intervention. Yeah, can I now request Professor Lee for your intervention?
Thank you very much to have invited me here for this panel discussion. And I like to shortly offer my contribution by starting to talk about something which in China we have policy and strategy advocacy called the Green Mountains, Golden Mountains. And that reflects the core value of that relationship between our human development and our nature. And I see that, that strategy in China, in development, what we call the new development strategy is very much aligned with what India during the G20 talk about this life mission, life. So I really the prevailing, and I like to just very quickly come to a 3 point. Number one, the prevailing paradigm, currently, we have to transform present production and consumption pattern to sustainable ones. It's mainly based on new institutional approach. So we believe that by using the incentives, by having laws and institutions, regulations in the market mechanism to can change people's behavior. And we have been actually focusing our approach year by year. But this is clearly very important, but it's not enough. Mission life provides what I call powerful alternative to change people's behavior and economic institutions. So that is something which I can see the contribution of India presidency this time to a great challenge we have faced. So we need to recognize we should not just talk about that. We just talk about the lip services. We should realize, to changing our lifestyle requires not only institutional, political things, but we need cultural, social things. And a second area I like to mention for developing countries, there's a trade-off between economic growth and sustainability, as mentioned just now. To solve this problem, first, we should transform the rationality-based economic growth patterns driven by consumption maximization to sustainable consumption and climate-friendly lifestyle-based new development approach. Second, we should promote climate-friendly and sustainable consumption technology innovation. And that is very important. Otherwise, the gap of green technology always exists, which is a great challenge. So now I have seen recently the World Bank is developing program, not just focusing on developing countries to buy and sell resources in the way that within the sustainable development framework, but to encourage the developing country to really managing the technology. So that is something which I really like to mention. Lastly, and I would say that mission life proposed by India presidency of G20 can be regarded as a powerful principle to ensure the realization of SDGs. Those principles are largely social cultural value based with great wisdom, knowledge, and experiences not only from India, but also from many developing countries like China. So we have to realize that, and therefore, to have global impact of this agenda, it is necessary to introduce those principles into global governance systems such as like G20, but we should not forget that social cooperation in the region globally should play the essential critical role. Thank you very much for this. Yeah.
Thank you so very much, and thanks for putting across your perspectives on Mission Life. We don't have much time left. What I'll request the panelists is to respond to one common question from me for 1 minute each, so that we can at least have 2 questions from the audience. And my question to each of you is, you can continue with your deliberation, of course, is LiFE the alternate actionable paradigm to save the planet?
Well, yes. LiFE is an important principle which one has to follow. And it is an achievable. India lived through this kind of a style, environmental protected lifestyle. And the only thing I would like to introduce, that there is a need to measure the well-being of the societies, introduce all the concepts which are relevant from this purpose, and it should not remain tied to the GDP. And there has to be a change in the measurement techniques and measurement parameters, where we can bring equity, we can bring environmental issues into the measurement, so that this can be properly implemented. Thank you.
I think that we do need more comprehensive and integrated approaches in order to solve this interlocking crisis. And I think that for those integrated and comprehensive policies to exist, we also need more evidence, and for the evidence, we need more data. So also building on the idea of thinking new ways of measuring progress, development, and economic growth, and thinking how we can produce this evidence that can then inform the formulation of policies, and then the monitoring and evaluation, we can achieve progress. Thank you.
Professor Prabhu.
I think the world has demonstrated that where there's political commitment, things are possible. Costa Rica has regenerated its forests in a matter of 3 decades from very low levels. Bhutan has adopted a very different paradigm. So it's political commitment and conviction that is important. And I would also say that the Global South has several examples, and it has been a norm setter. The human development paradigm, I might remind all of you, emerged from South Asia. And the SDG, the participatory process, was due to the Global South's pressures. So I think we have in it, and the LiFE mission has been proposed in India. So we have the wherewithal, we have the pathways that are already there, and we have the lifestyles that have been adopted in our cultures, which we need to remind ourselves, support, and take forward. So I do hope that with this presidency in the Global South for the next 2 years, we will be a norm setter for the world once again. Thank you.
Professor Lee.
Yes, I think this actionable, because unless we have a very strong political commitment, it's very important that we should not ignore, and we should also second this social environment that people recognize is important. We need political, need to get support from the society, public, and thirdly, we need a kind of technical measurement. We need a lot of think tank studies, policy studies, and academic studies to really change the policy discourse. And lastly, and we, as far as I see from what China has been doing over the last 10 years, that transfer China's economy into green economy, and I personally have seen a lot of real changes. Therefore, we should not argue unless we are really united and understand this, and we don't have to put a very complicated, this is a very simple, and we should not go for political divide, and we see that is something which is no negotiable, no arguable, so we go straight forward for everyone's village, for all our common place. We see India, China. So that's I'm very optimistic for this, and the reason why I come here, I come here twice for this conference, support this LiFE mission agenda as a Chinese. I'm not India. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So we heard 2 rounds of deliberations from the speakers. Now it's open to the floor. We can have a few questions.
Good afternoon. This is Sekhon from private equity from New York. We actually also do some studies, and we wanted to actually get some ideas from your side. How does LiFE mission also incorporate some of those things. So you mentioned, sir, about the GDP. GDP definitely is not a factor to be bothered about. The gross value add happening at the state level, country level, sector specific level is where the wastages are happening, which are impacting the SDG goals in a big way. Second is with the advent of fourth industrial revolution, many of those technologies will help us to improve our aggregate efficiency at a globe level, which is around 23%. We still have 77% of value to be realized. So how does LiFE actually incorporate something which is more value specific? Because qualitative statements will really not help us until and unless we have some measurement and then some improvement which is implemented, and we are here to finance that all.
Okay.
So your guidance on that.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm an intern with ORF, and my question is to Ashish Kumar sir. So you spoke of eco-centric industrialization, and even the second phase of the LiFE mission is about changing production as consumption changes. So as we move to greener consumption, we will see a rise in demand for new materials like rare earth elements. So is Niti Aayog or any other organization working on a strategy to move away from certain monopolistic suppliers of these materials, or develop cleaner mining strategies, and develop any circular economy for recycling these rare earth elements in India? Thank you.
Yeah, we can take the next question from the gentleman behind you.
Yes, sir. To be very brief, sir.
Can you just introduce yourself?
I'm Dr. S.N. Ojha, Central Institute of Fisheries Education, sir. Can we develop some index for LiFE? Maybe it may have consumerism as a one indicator, then green technology another indicator, use, reuse another indicator, political commitment, industrial commitment. And then because this is required, because we have to, if this indicators is there, then we can correctly mobilize people, mentor people, and monitor the program.
Okay.
So that's all.
So I think we have these three questions. So let me start from Professor Lee, and we come towards this side finally to Mr. Kumar.
Thank you. Thank you.
So you have
Let me just,
2 minutes to respond.
Okay,
Professor Lee.
just pick up the last question first, to see that technically it's feasible, it's viable to have any kind of index, and of course requires data, and requires global level collaboration, and also requires a regional level, country level, so at the different levels. And the most important issue for my opinion is not really technical indicator itself. It is the way how you could see your society and how you're going to look at the progress and how you're going to appreciate the progress of your development. And unless those base fundamental things are not changed, and all these technical matter, technical solutions will not be really useful. Thank you.
Yeah, Professor Prabhu.
Two things regarding measurement. There are always some missing indicators and there are empty indicators. There are indicators which do not indicate what they're supposed to indicate. So I think we should be very careful about these, empty indicators. You have like life expectancy, for example. Once upon a time, it was long and healthy life. Now it represents only a long life and not a healthy life. So I think we should be very careful of these empty indicators, and I would exercise caution in that. And not everything is measurable. There are some subjective, and qualitative is equally valuable as quantitative. Secondly, about equity and sustainability, a question that the chairperson raised. I think sustainability is nothing but intergenerational equity. And therefore, to pose them as opposing each other would be a wrong framing of it. I would say both are together. And I would also say that it is necessary for us to recognize the value and values and norms in development. Without that, nothing is possible. Just talking about policies and about systems and institutions need to be just. Political systems have to accept that there needs to be a transformational change, and without that, no change is possible. And business as usual will lead us to the same consequences. And we are facing an existential crisis. It's not a normal crisis that we are facing. So if we want to survive, we have to change. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Florencia.
Some of the points I was going to make were already mentioned, but the fact that I think not everything is measurable, we do have many, especially when we're talking about human-centered approaches and how there are many subjectivities that we cannot really put a number on them. And at the same time, I'm also, when we talk about these issues as a LiFE approach, for example, that they are quite multidimensional, I think we also need to be cautious about having an index, because we have many dimensions and different fields in which we should be addressing and trying to understand how they work instead of having just one number that can sum up everything. So thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Kumar.
Two questions I understand I'll be addressing. First, people are talking about eco-industrialization and the issue of who is doing it or who is really looking at it. First of all, I thought that this is a forum where there can be a framework developed for integrated industrial ecology system. There is no uniform system available at present. People do specific studies and they have to be on both ways. Already industrialization done in a bad manner, which is resulting into all kinds of consequences which the people are suffering from. So to that, my suggestion, and there are suggestions are, that there are 6 R principles, which we all use it: the reduce, reuse, recycle, recover as much as possible, redesign, and rethink. So the approach has to be more geographic, more local, and try to implement it in a manner so that we are able to reduce the effect of this on environment. That is the point. And there is a discussion at various levels of ministries in the government, and they want to do it, but it's a question of how it gets percolated down to the people. Second part is the new industrialization which should take place has to be taken into account where a strategic planning is required, where technical, ecological, socio-cultural, and economic factors are to be taken into account, so that once we develop industry, there is an internal consumption and recovery, and least of it is getting as a part of effluent, and that to be treated both for the GHG emissions and also the effluent treatment. So that's on your question. About the other question about how it is to be done, because ultimately it is GDP at the top, at the national level, but we have to go down to the local levels, to the district level. Even today in many countries, we do not compute district domestic product. We do some kind of a exercise to do it, but there is a need to go down this exercise further to understand where exactly is the problem and where the priorities exist. And that whole development has to be suited to the data and things generated at that level. And as rightly said by ma'am, it is not only the numbers which is important, it is also equally important to see how good is the participation of the people, how can we convince and bring them into the development process, which is ultimate. So it is not only the monitoring and the evaluation, it is the participation, which is, I think, is a very important thing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much. So with that, we come to the end of this particular panel. There have been some very, very crucial points that have emerged, especially whether LiFE can really be an actionable option, an actionable paradigm. First of all, let's understand that so far, we do not have canons of LiFE, that this are the characteristics or these are the parameters which actually characterize LiFE. So for the global north and the global south, there has to be some kind of a divergence in the delineation of LiFE. We can pretty well understand that. This is more so because if I bring in something that Florencia was talking about, in terms of the role of the ecosystems in human life. As far as, I recall this paper by Pawan Sukhdev in Nature, way back in 2009. The title of the paper was Valuing the Nature. And he introduced this concept known as GDP of the poor. Ecosystem services are GDP of the poor. The ecosystem is providing certain services free of cost through its organic working to the community, human community, and the human community in and around protected areas are extracting more from the ecosystem than what they're getting from the formal or the informal economy or from the human system. And in fact, lately, in my own research, I developed this index called the Ecosystem Dependency Index. In certain cases, especially in fact in South Asia, it turned out that the Ecosystem Dependency Index, which is the ratio of the values of the ecosystem services and the income of the community of that particular region, was greater than 1. That means they are essentially extracting or getting more from the ecosystem than what they're getting from the economy. This implies that if we destroy the ecosystem, we are destroying the GDP of the poor. So it is not only that, even if we are away from the ecosystem, whether we are in the city or whatever, the ecosystem dependency remains, because fundamentally, we remain dependent on that ecosystem service, whether it's the provisioning service or suppose the regulating service. So in that case, we by all means need to align ourselves with environment in some way or the other. Because as, let me just echo what Professor Prabhu stated, and what Ashish ji also stated in here, that after all, while we are talking about equity on the one side, we also need to talk about the intergenerational equity, which is being perceived as a sustainability factor in here. So yes, we have to talk of efficiency. We cannot, from the global south perspective, we cannot talk of degrowth. We have to grow, we have to consume, but at the same time leave sufficient resources for the posterior, for the future community to grow and consume. So how do we do that? Now here lies the critical element. Here lies how we redelineate, define, and in some way or the other, describe life in our own life and livelihoods. So with that, let me just end this session. Let me thank all the panelists for fabulous interventions, and I'm sure that we can have a round of applause for the panelists, because this has been one of the exhilarating sessions that I have moderated so far, and that too, and also because of the fact that the panelists have been so very disciplined that we could finish it in time. So, and thanks to the audience for patient listening and raising some very, very interesting questions and concerns, which really enriched the discussion. Thank you, thanks all.